Hello, everyone. I'm Maeve Webster from Menu Matters, and I'm here to speak with you about the post-COVID consumer and how the hospitality industry can start planning for that consumer. Obviously, we are in a position right now where the hospitality industry is facing some very unique challenges. It's been a very rough few months, and I know that many of you are hip deep in dealing with all of the challenges and all of the issues right now and surviving through to the end of the year in some cases. But I think now is really the time to start preparing for that post-COVID consumer, to start looking forward and looking ahead to the middle of 2021 and beyond, and preparing yourselves to leverage all of the opportunities that you can potentially leverage, not just to get your business running as quickly as possible and start increasing revenue as quickly as possible, but also to start positioning yourselves to pandemic-proof yourselves for the next few years, and to start gaining share and rethinking your position in the marketplace, which is not a bad thing. Rethinking your position sometimes sounds like a negative, where maybe our position before was bad. I don't think that that's the case. If anything, the pandemic has taught us that now is the time to start making some bold choices, to start really thinking about the kind of innovation that can push your business to the next level and start creating an incredibly unique and defensible competitive positioning within your market, outside of your market, quite frankly, on-site as well as off-site. We're going to be talking about all of those different opportunities that you can start leverage and things to think about as you move forward. The pandemic, in many ways, has actually reset the playing field. Now, for some operators, that is a great thing, and that means that you've got a lot of really unique and interesting opportunity to start gaining market share going forward. For other operators, that's been a real challenge because you likely are facing deteriorated market share and you're building from the ground up. Now, building from the ground up is daunting, particularly when you were a market leader in the markets that you're playing in. But again, consider it an opportunity to really rethink how you're going to gain that market share and how you can defend that market share going forward. So it can be really daunting to think about this resetting of the playing field, but it does not necessarily have to be negative. From the hotel's point of view right now, there are so many changes and so many issues to be dealing with when it comes to the consumers that you had and probably have now. From your past consumer perspective, you are dealing with a loss of business travel, a loss of vacation travel, a loss of international travel, shifts in domestic travel. And then in some cases, you've got new customers coming in that you likely never would have had before because there is, in some cases, limited options available. And in many cases, a lot of operators have lowered their room costs per night. So guests who might never have been able to afford staying at your property are now coming in. Now, that is an interesting opportunity to start rethinking who some of your target guests are, or gaining new customers who might return when prices are higher. But obviously that's challenging because these are customers who are used to certain items being available, services being available, costs across property. And so that certainly creates unique challenges. But remember, within all these challenges, there are definitely opportunities. Now, I'm not going to be spending a lot of time talking about sanitation in this presentation. You all know what the situation is right now. People expect sanitation across the board. It has to be best in class. Best in class for everyone is now table stakes when it comes to sanitation. So we're not going to talk about that. What I will talk about, however, is from probably April through until June, there were a lot of pieced together and patchwork solutions to the issues of social distancing, sanitation, how do we deal with PPE and all of those different issues. But something like this is no longer appropriate. Granted, this is probably not what any of your properties look like. But that being said, these patchwork solutions can't continue. People do not want to keep feeling like they're in the middle of a temporary situation. It's been going on long enough that we all need to have what are going to be permanent solutions in place that are for the near term. And by that, I mean at least for the next year or two. Consider any solution that you create to this problem that we're facing right now something that's going to have to last. It cannot look temporary. It cannot look pieced together. You can't be figuring this out to a certain degree as you go along, because customers are frustrated with the situation. They are tired of having to deal with a lot of this. And I know that there's a lot of data out there saying that consumers want to support us, the hospitality industry, that they understand the challenges that we're facing. But ultimately, when they need to spend money, whether they're trying to take a vacation, whether it's a business person who's traveling, they are expecting a level of service that matches the money that they are giving you. And this is going to become increasingly true as we move forward over the next year and start heading into what is likely going to be a recession of some degree. People have unemployment issues at home, among family members. So we need to constantly be thinking about what is the value we are delivering, because we have to consider what is happening now, normal life. It can't be considered a temporary situation. We have no idea how long this is going to go on. All of us certainly hope that it's not going to go on for very much longer, but we don't know. Nobody knows what the fall and winter is going to look like. Nobody knows when the vaccine is going to be ready. We have to be approaching this as though this is the situation we are facing now going forward, and how do we address that? As things start to look up, as people start to spend more money and travel more, a vaccine comes out, whatever ends up happening, and business starts picking back up, fantastic. But you need to be planning for the situation now and not hoping that it's going to get better sooner rather than later. So what does this post-COVID consumer look like? And what are some of the shifts? Well, we've been in this now, as all of you know, for 5 or 6 months. That is long enough for behavioral patterns to shift. Even though the changes were forced upon consumers, habits take about 6 months to change. So at this point, we have to assume that the habits that consumers are picking up now are going to be long-term habits, or at least habits that are going to take a while to break. So some of the changes that we're seeing, number one, values, and how consumers are actually defining what a value is. That's probably one of the biggest changes. One, it's being brought on by changing economic circumstances for a lot of consumers, but we also have layered on to the pandemic issues of social justice, environmental and sustainability issues are still there, and certainly there were a lot of really impactful photos that came out of the lockdown supporting how changes in human behavior can impact the environment. Consumers now are placing a much larger emphasis on the values of a company and how those values match their own values, the consumer's values. And they are going to be spending their money based on those values. Additionally, when it comes to how they define what a good value is, consider that, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, consider that some of the social distancing and some of the other behavioral changes that are driven by the pandemic are going to start changing what they consider a value. Personal space is now a higher commodity at this point, and something that people not just expect, but want more of for a number of different reasons. Obviously, sanitation is going to be part of that value equation, safety, comfort, security, all of that. So what they're considering a value is changing. Loyalty, this is another huge one and a really important one for the hospitality industry to consider. Loyalty has been eroded. During the lockdown, a lot of properties closed down for months and months. Some are still closed down. So consumers who might have considered that property, if they had to travel for whatever reason, couldn't get into it, are trying other properties. We've seen this with retail food products. We've seen this with restaurants. We've seen this with a whole host of other industries. Clothing is another great example, where consumers have been forced to try new products, new brands, new categories because of a lack of availability. Expect that some of those new products, new brands, new hospitality brands, and new properties that they have experienced will become part of their repertoire. That might help some properties. You may have gained new customers as a result of this, or for some of you, that might mean that you have also lost some customers. So you really need to consider how you are going to gain those customers back, what kind of communication do you have? What kind of programs do you have? And how do you consider that loyalty issue as either a positive or a negative for your property? And then how do you address it? And then, of course, technology. Technology was a large part of a lot of the solutions that we were looking at pre-pandemic, where we were looking at labor issues, costs, certainly some challenges with some of the larger properties. How do you get product to customers? How do you communicate with them? How do you keep them engaged in a property? Technology was part of that solution base. Now consider where we're going to be with technology next year, about 5 years ahead. And the interesting part with this is that before the pandemic, consumers were concerned, and probably right now are still to a certain degree, with how technology is going to replace jobs and how that's going to impact the labor market. But issues around sanitation and safety and security, as well as costs, consistency in service, a lot of these other issues are now beginning to eclipse some of those concerns about the labor market. And consumers now are far more open to technology being used on a far wider array and in a lot of different ways in order to ease that process, make them feel more confident, eliminate some of those touch points that certainly right now are making them uncomfortable. So really start thinking about how you can start using technology in your operation, whether it's back of house in the kitchen, whether it's front of house with the customers, but appropriately, obviously, for your brand. Don't use technology to solve a problem internally that ends up creating a problem for your customers. It can't just be about convenience and speed and lower cost if it starts diminishing the customer experience, the patron experience while they're there. And one thing that we've been talking about as part of this is this idea of having to gain back consumer trust. And I actually think that's the wrong way to be looking at this. Gaining trust is probably the lowest common denominator for any hospitality operator, whether you're a hotel or a restaurant or anybody else. If gaining trust is the only thing you're looking at, that is literally the least that you can be offering a customer. If they didn't trust you before the pandemic, they're not going to trust you now. What you need to be doing is creating reasons for customers to be spending money at your property. Now, obviously, sanitation and consistency of providing safe and clean quarters for people to stay in is a baseline. That has to be table stakes. Beyond that, give them a reason. Why are people going to be spending money at your location versus any others? I would argue at this point that larger operators now have a bit of an edge over the boutique operators who are beginning to grab a lot of share pre-pandemic. Any of the bigger players now in hospitality have a louder voice, probably the ability to institute some broader and more intense sanitation efforts. You have more staff, you have more access to resources. So this is an area where bigger brands can definitely succeed. And it's an area where boutique brands and other properties really need to think, how do you start gaining that back? How do you start gaining that edge back? Now, I was actually traveling to Chicago for the first time. It's the first trip I've taken a couple of weeks ago, and was considering two different properties. One was a new property, luxury property that just opened, that was offering some pretty steep discounts. I thought that would be interesting. I'd really like to stay at this property. But every amenity was gone. No restaurants, no room service, no gym, no pool. None of those amenities were there. But a property I'd stayed at before, which is probably more mid-tier, also had discounts, also had no amenities. And so I was left having to decide, how much is that room really going to be worth to me at the luxury property? I would argue at this point, if you have had to pull back on all of your amenities, what exactly are you offering if all you have is a room? How do you start rethinking what that experience is, what that value proposition is? It can't just be, our rooms look nicer. That certainly can be a value for some customers, but it can't be the only thing. So I think this is part of that leveling the playing field. You really need to start thinking about, what is the value proposition if you take away some of the amenities that you could rely on to help create that competitive edge or that luxury proposition for guests. This is the most important thing, because the experience at this point is everything to customers. The experience includes the sanitation and the safety and all of that, but it has to be more than that. It has to be about hospitality. That is what we're about. How do you make people feel welcome? We're all dealing with the masks and all kinds of things that are making it less hospitable to be out of your own home. How do you start working around that? That can't be the baseline for everyone. So we all really need to rethink this idea of hospitality and what hospitality means in the age of a pandemic, when we're all dealing with a lot of inhospitable issues and regulations and all of that. So I think this is really where the hospitality industry and hotels need to start sitting down and thinking about what your brand proposition is, what your competitive positioning is, and how do you start creating these new and unique opportunities. So let's run through a couple of them in the last few minutes. First, this idea of quarantines. Now, I don't know how much longer quarantines are going to go on. They may go on for the next 6 months, 12 months. We don't know. But while it's tough to think about this because everybody's, needs every last dime, quarantines can present a really unique opportunity to create an experience that is remembered. If somebody is forced to quarantine in your property for some period of time, whether it's a week or 2 weeks, how do you start making that quarantine proposition better for them and actually not a negative experience for them? So think about that. What does that mean? It doesn't necessarily need to mean discounts, cut rates, and all of that. How do you make that forced 2-week quarantine in your property something that they'll actually remember in a good way? I think everyone needs to have quarantine plans to consider how they start easing the situation for the people who are on your property for long periods of time for any kind of a quarantine. So consider that an opportunity. It's challenging. It could be cost ineffective in some cases, but consider that issue of loyalty and the erosion of loyalty, that this is a way that you can start fighting back against that loyalty issue. Certainly match the services to the brand. And this was something that we talked about at Mise last year. And this is certainly something that I've talked with many of you about at separate conferences and individually, is this idea of new services that certainly are solving a problem internally, operationally, but may be off-brand strategy for your patrons. A good example is certainly the image that we've got here is room service. A lot of the room service solutions, because room service is constantly a challenge and never a good cost proposition for the operator. But in order to solve, or the solutions that are solving against room service can sometimes be off-brand. If you're staying at a luxury property but receiving food in to-go containers that look just like something you might get at the local fast food operator, is that really the experience, getting back to that idea of experience, that you want those guests to be having? Even if they don't need the elaborate table and the sterling silver dome and all of that. It doesn't need to be the traditional room service, but what is the new room service that solves for your patrons' problems but stays within your brand strategy? That is critical as you're moving forward. What does that mean for packaging? What does that mean for service style, delivery style? And then how do you work all of that within the pandemic situation? Many of you are dealing with low occupancy, whether that is low occupancy because of travel shifts or whether it's low occupancy because of state and local regulations for capacity limitation. Consider some of this an opportunity. This is an opportunity for the people who are staying on your property to have experiences that no one else will have. How do you create experiences that leverage the space that they now have, the ownership of the property that they can feel, the amount of freedom they may have on your property, depending on the kind of property that you're dealing with? There are opportunities now to create events that are smaller people and obviously socially distanced and whatnot. How do you create those events and start taking advantage of that? Because these are opportunities for upsells to your patrons. If they have the opportunity to have an experience they'll never have on property again, this could be a once in a lifetime for the people who are staying there. So think about how you can start taking advantage of that low occupancy and make it something that works for you and gives them a reason to spend more. And thinking long term, this idea of social distancing. This is a park in Brooklyn. A lot of parks are now doing this. This is probably more space than the people in Brooklyn have had personal space in decades. So I would say this is definitely a habit that's going to change. People are going to want more space. This idea of being jammed in with a lot of other people, you know, obviously nightclubs and bars are a different situation. That's a different experience people are looking for. But at a hotel property, you need to start thinking about what this idea of wanting more personal space may mean for your, you know, rethinking the design of your property inside, outside, new properties that you're looking to open. How do you start accommodating this desire for more space? It might not be socially distanced space, but it is going to be a desire for more space, at least for the next year or two. And getting back to this idea of room service, it's not just how you get the food there and the packaging that it's in, but consider what room service might look like and could be from an experience point of view, not just the quality of the food and how it gets there, but think about how restaurants have had to change the way they look at delivery. They're looking at meal kits now. They're looking at uh, options where the consumer builds their own item once the food is actually delivered. If you've got families staying, the families might not feel comfortable going back down to the restaurant to eat in a group. So if you've got a family eating in the room, how do you create a unique family experience that is not just a bunch of individual dishes, but lets them feel like they're experiencing a family event? So think about all of these different ways you can rethink the items on your menu, obviously to ensure quality, but to rethink the actual in-room experience with that item. Is it a cocktail kit that they can put together because it's something that's unique and interesting and they can experience on their own? Is it interactive dishes? So go through your menu, not just think about how you can make room service more profitable, hopefully, but how do you make it a unique experience in and of itself? Because more people are going to be eating in their room, certainly for the next probably 6 months and going forward. So you don't want that experience to be the lesser than experience that your property has to offer. Of course, as with restaurants, hotels are dealing with the increased importance of retail spaces because consumers may not want to have somebody deliver food up to their room. You might not have your restaurant open and room service might not be available for a host of reasons. So your retail spaces need to be working harder for you, or you need to be thinking about how to get a bigger and more dynamic retail space on your property. This is probably another habit that's going to go forward, where people are going to be looking for retail options in more spaces, including hotel properties. How does that retail space meet your consumers' needs, fit your brand strategy, offer them a dynamic experience with a wide variety of options that make sense based on the types of stays that you typically get, business versus vacation, families versus singles, etc. So really make sure that this doesn't just look like a convenience store plopped down on your property, but it's something that is not only working to solve your patrons' problems, but it's also something that is building your brand equity and increasing the experiences that they can have and the unique and memorable experiences. It shouldn't just be a store with some goods and just a revenue generator. It is an experience opportunity, and that's the way we need to think of everything. This is something, again, that I talked about pre-pandemic, and it's even more important now. If you have not thought about how you can leverage the ghost kitchen concept on your property, you need to start thinking about it now. And these ghost kitchens are not just for your own patrons, where you might be offering restaurants that your guests can start ordering from that are actually from your own kitchen, but they may or may not know that. These are opportunities to start getting revenue streams with your local customers as well, whether they're businesses, depending on where you're at, whether they're residences, whatever that ends up looking like. You need to start thinking about how do you start shoring up revenue streams, even if we go back in a lockdown. Hopefully that won't happen. It doesn't look like it will. But worst case scenario, what kind of revenue streams can you keep going into the property if the worst ends up happening? Ghost kitchens can offer you great opportunities for additional revenue streams. And something else to consider, the car has become even more important for the American consumer, and many are now traveling domestically, more so than they would have in a typical year where they might have gone abroad to one degree or another. This opportunity opens up new customers that you may not have gotten before. It opens up opportunities for car-based events and experiences on your property, depending on the size of your property and your parking lot. If there are more cars around, how do you start leveraging that safety people feel in cars? You've seen restaurants do drive-in movies, things of that nature. Start thinking about, if people are driving more, you've got an opportunity to grab not only guests who may be staying at your hotel property, but how do you start creating events that draw in the locals who will drive to your property for a unique event that is, of course, socially distanced and, you know, within the regulations. But cars can offer really interesting, unique experiential opportunities for you. How do you start leveraging this? This is something that's going to keep going. And I'm going to leave you with this thought that, bottom line, the pandemic has blown apart everything that we've known up until now. And that seems extreme and dramatic, but it is really true. And now is not the time to start saying no, and we can never do that, can't be done, not here. Now is the time to start thinking, what is the bravest and boldest innovation we can potentially embark on that will set us apart, position us for significant growth as soon as we get through this post-pandemic period, or as soon as we get into the post-pandemic period? And how do I start building a unique and defensible proposition, even if the worst happens in a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever that ends up being? We now have a property and revenue streams that can weather the next pandemic. We all hate to think that way, but this is going to be the reality going forward. So be bold, think of the most outrageous potential innovations you can do, and then go for it. Now is the time to do that. If not now, when? Don't be shy, don't be conservative in your innovation. You really need to be thinking about bold steps so that when the economy starts picking up, you are positioned to really take advantage of that. So I thank you for the time that you've given me today. If you have any questions, any follow-up, if there's any way I can help you, or if you just want to brainstorm, I'm here for you. That's what I do. So please reach out and contact me. I'm happy to get on the phone, talk through any issue you want to talk through. I want to make sure that our industry comes out of this as strong as possible. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the conference.